We're going to get started. This is part of our new affiliate series. So Alvin Thomas is in the School of Human Ecology and has relatively recently become an IRP affiliate, and we're thrilled to welcome him into our IRP community. His talk he just described as a bit of a hodgepodge of different projects that he's working on, which means that he's happy to talk more or less about anything and take questions as we go. So please, at least raise your hand. Don't just shout out, but you can interrupt and take the presentation in the direction you would like it to go. So we're thrilled to have you here. Glad that you're with us to share your work. So I'll take it away.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for having me. As I was navigating my way through the maze that is Sewell Building, if you've been here for the first time or your second time, it's a doozy. I am convinced that there are probably people for last month's seminar still roaming the building trying to get into this space. Took me quite a while to get to it. But thank you very much, IRP. Thank you very much, Catherine, for this really this honor to share with you. Thanks to all of you for braving the storm, braving the snow, and braving Sewell's design to be part of this discussion. So I prepared just a really extensive presentation of all of the work that I've done and that I'm doing related to fatherhood, related to positive youth development, but you could come in. But I'm hoping that what will happen is hopefully a more dynamic, more natural kind of discussion. So if there's something that feels like it's more interesting to the audience, then
I think they turned it down. I'm
no,
sorry.
they turned it down. I'll just keep talking. You can fiddle as much as you want. So if there's a topic or a particular thing that I raise that's a little bit more interesting to the audience at this point in time, I am more than happy to spend time talking about it and exploring it with us. My intention is not to try to push us to get to the end of the presentation, but rather to engage and to have that dialogue and hopefully have some learning come out of it. So again, don't feel like you're stopping me from reaching the end of my presentation. I'm absolutely sure that I will present this somewhere else again and maybe reach the end of that presentation. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I'm currently in the School of Human Ecology in the Department of Human Development Family Studies. My focus is kind of bifurcated, but also kind of intersecting. So I look at positive youth development specifically among African American children, and even more specifically among African American boys. And as a way of getting to positive youth development and strengthening positive youth development and engaging and supporting resilience development, I focus on the engagement of fathers and the involvement of fathers. And I use those two words separately: engagement, looking more at the interaction between the individual, that's the father, and service providers, and involvement, meaning the father's direct engagement with the family system, whether that be with the child alone, with the child and the mother, the child and the extended family, looking at those spaces. And I kind of thought of this title because I was concerned, and I think David and others who were doing work on fathers are concerned about the narrative that exists about fatherhood in general, but about specific subsets of fathers. And so more recently, the role of fathers has kind of begun to gather attention with people starting to focus on parenting and the family context when we start thinking about child development. Often when we say parent, what we actually mean by default is mom. You think of when the school calls home, usually it's mom that they call, even if they have dad's number. Even if dad is the allocated contact, the school generally will call mom. If you take a child in for therapy, the therapist, I should know this because that's how I was trained, that's how we've done it. The therapist deals with whoever comes in, and usually that's going to be mom or grandma or an aunt. And we don't ask about dad. Where is dad? Is dad involved? The assumption is that either dad is not involved or dad does not need to be involved unless something higher level is necessary, and then we bring that in as a collateral reporter. So thinking and rethinking about fathers as indispensable partners in the health of children, the health of families, and specifically in this case, in the health and development of black families. Did I skip this? There we go. So as far as the outline, we'll talk a little bit about what we mean when we say fathers and what this engagement in fatherhood looks like, the benefits to fathers being engaged and involved, whether or not there's any father interest and any support to the idea that there is father interest, some of the challenges and strategies related to father engagement and father involvement, and maybe think a little bit about some policy suggestions and, of course, question and answer. Although it says question and answer at the end, please, like I said at the beginning, question and answer can happen throughout. So let's think first about fathers. And so you will see throughout my slides a number of photographs of black kids with their fathers. And that is deliberate. The intent here is to normalize seeing fathers, black fathers, in these spaces, in these roles. The intent is to challenge our narrative, challenge our default assumption of what fatherhood looks like for black families, what father engagement looks like for black families, and hopefully we leave with some dent in our default assumptions and start to think a little bit differently when we start thinking about engaging black families, engaging black fathers. So when we say fathers, we are of course usually thinking automatically of biological fathers and stepfathers. But there are other fathers beyond just the biological and the stepfathers. There's that subset of fathers, the non-resident father. Those are the fathers who don't necessarily share residence or don't share living space with their child. And then there's the largely almost invisible but still very active social father or father figures. That's uncles, cousins, other relatives, grandfathers, who are in one way or another stepping in and providing a father role. And again, kind of attacking our, do I want to say attacking? Yes, I want to say attacking. Attacking our default assumption that because there is a father figure present, it means that the biological father is absent or has abdicated the role. That is not necessarily true. A father figure can step in with the father still physically present, still psychologically present. A stepfather can step in with the biological father still psychologically present and psychologically and physically present. Okay? So let's kind of make sure we're challenging those assumptions. So what exactly what kinds of roles do these fathers play? That's whether they're biological fathers, father figures, stepfathers. Very often we assume that prenatal support is not present, except if it's happening in a marriage space. So we generally assume that if the parents are married, then there's some kind of prenatal support present because the father is physically present and he's almost obligated to be at those appointments. Not necessarily true. But we're finding across the board now that even once we've started studying it, that even among fathers who are not sharing physical space, meaning non-resident fathers, there still is a significantly high amount of prenatal support. So fathers who don't share residence with the mom or are not in a romantic relationship continue to be involved, continue to attend prenatal appointments with their former spouse out of in interest to the health of the child, attending other kinds of appointments beyond the prenatal appointments, supporting mom's health and mom's nutrition throughout the pregnancy and beyond the pregnancy, and of course supporting their own health. That's the father supporting his own health and the child's needs. I may talk a little bit about what that looks like if you ask me about it when we get to the AABN study, African American Breastfeeding Network. So I'm seeding a question here. If you want to know a little bit more about that, ask me when we get to that point. Other parenting practices, so things like caregiving and play, the child-related decisions around healthcare and other forms of support, and basic child well-being and support that fathers are engaged in, and that's across the different types of fathers. When we think of what the benefits are for engaging fathers, there's quite an extensive bit of literature spanning probably over the last 3 or 4 decades detailing some of the benefits. one of which is overall better outcomes, and outcomes meaning social outcomes, emotional outcomes, cognitive development of the child. The HBCD study, which just recently got launched on this campus, is going to be looking at what that looks like across the board. We've seen some of this also in the Future of Family study, what used to be called the Fragile Family Study. So people like Kathy Egan and others who've done work on the Future of Family study, looking at what father involvement looks like across the lifespan and the potential benefits, showing that cognitively children are much better, emotionally and socially children are doing a lot better when the fathers are involved. Less toxic stress within the family system for the mom, and of course we understand that there's going to be some kind of spillover effect from the relationship between the mom and the dad spilling over to the child. So reducing that level of toxic stress when fathers are engaged and are involved. Fewer behavior problems. And so I looked at a couple of articles that were focused specifically on higher level conduct problems among adolescents. And what they found was when parents were involved in the interventions, the therapy that was directed at higher level cognitive behavioral problems, they saw significant decrements in negative outcomes for kids. So kids seem to do better when mom or dad was involved in the intervention that was meant to treat the cognitive issue, the behavioral issues. But when dad and mom were involved, they saw a slightly higher level of improvement, but the overall benefit was that the improvement, the benefit was longer lasting, and relapse, there was a lot longer period for relapse, or there was no relapse at all. So it's not just that kids were doing better, but the benefit of kids doing better was a lot longer lasting. Positive family norms, increased scoping and other support resources for the family, positive development for the parents, a number of really great outcomes for the children, but also really great outcomes for the family system. Most recently, a couple of articles came out, one of which was an article by Sarah Gold, Kathy Eden, and others from the Future of Families study, and essentially looking at whether or not there's any payoff to the engagement or involvement of fathers in children's lives in the families. And it had this really great longitudinal lens to it, and it found that longitudinal impact of father's involvement had a protective effect against negative adolescent behavior. So father's involvement during the early years, at the early stages, had longitudinal benefit for the child as far as behavioral issues, and that the benefit seemed very similar for children with non-residential fathers, and that was true for both boys and girls. So both boys and girls, resident and non-resident father, it didn't matter. For both of those, there was significant benefit and decrements in behavioral problems across the lifespan from birth over to adolescence. Another study by Jay Fagan, one of the first ones to come out this year, looked at the chronic reoccurring myth of low-income black father absence from the lives of adolescents. The suggestion that black fathers, and I usually kind of take a step back and get on my little soapbox and preach for a little bit. I will try not to do that today. I might be forced into it nonetheless because it kind of raises my blood pressure a little bit. But there's this usual pernicious myth that black fathers who are not living in the home with children, or non-resident black fathers, are absent, that they're not present, whatever not present means, that they've abdicated their role, that they're uninterested, that they've left the family, that they're invisible, that they don't contribute. And I hopefully I've covered the full gamut of all of the foolishness that's often spoken. It's not true. The research does not suggest it. However, because it's sexy, it sells, it's tradition, and it's what we've known so far, we're going to keep saying it until eventually, like with deworming medicine, we deworm it out of academia, we deworm it out of our thought patterns, and hopefully we deworm it out of our institutions. So that when you get into these institutions, you can start influencing policy away from this kind of language, away from these kinds of stories, and start reflecting people's actual lives. And so J. Fagan found that this myth of the low-income, poorer, absent black fathers was not sustained, not substantiated, and this is nothing new. We have other studies that have found it, but again, J. Fagan was using the Future Families data, I think, to show that low-income, non-resident, and co-resident black fathers were no less involved with their children than fathers of other ethnic groups and fathers of other socioeconomic groups. Yes?
Is this study nationally recognized?
That's a good question. I have not checked. I probably should go and check again. Yeah. But if you're interested, I'm sure we could find a way to get you that paper. Yeah.
What do we know about what drives the variation in the amount of time that non-resident dads spend with their kids? So how much of it is mom actually keeps them away, which I put stories like that? How much of it is dad's got a new family and isn't that interested? How much of it is just mom and dad don't get along? And so it's kind of a conflict. Know much about that? I'm
not sure if we know. That'd be a really good. Where's David? Write that down. that might be a good paper. I'm not sure if we know what the specific. We know what the contributors are, or at least we know some of the contributors. As far as having done work that specifically passes out how much of that variance goes to which contributor, I'm not sure we know that quite yet. We do know that policy is also part of it, especially for low-income families. So I think of a recent study that I was collaborating with Cleopatra Caldwell at University of Michigan, and we were looking at, I should say she was looking at connecting with fathers in specific inner Chicago neighborhoods. And one of the challenges was that you couldn't go to the home where the child lived with the mom if the mom was receiving certain public assistances. Because if dad was seen as being part of the home, spending any amount of time in that home, mom could potentially lose that public assistance. And so dads were staying away from children as a way of protecting children. We saw a similar kind of phenomenon in a recent study that I did with Julie Pullman and David Pate. Now I can say from School of Human Ecology, where we were looking at recidivism for dads who were recently released from jail. And one of the main themes that came up was that dads were saying, I am going to choose not to return to my family because I am afraid of what my return to the family, what risk my return to the family, my potential lives from before might incur for my child. And so I would tell my partner not to bring my child, my son or my daughter, to see me in jail during this period of incarceration because of what I think might be negative connotations that my child might develop or negative impacts that experience might have for my child. So we see stepfathers, fathers of different classifications, choosing to step away from the family as a way to protect the family. But specifically to your question, no, we've not passed out what some of those, the variants that some of those predictors would have. Thanks for that question. Yes, go ahead, Quinn.
With the parasitism fatherhood study in terms of the father-child interaction, was that done before there was much more of a normalization of like Zoom calls, telecalls with prison visits for children?
I'm not sure what you mean by normalization because that's
post-COVID, much more.
So I think if I'm correct, I think the data was collected pre-COVID. But again, it depends on the specific institution and the warden at that institution, the state, and the policies and mindsets around visitation and around connecting persons who are incarcerated to their families. Some people are of the view that if you're incarcerated, you're here to be punished, so you should not have connection to your child because that is something that only quote unquote free people should have. But I think I'm not sure if for this data, but I know that Julie currently does have data from fathers who were able to have that kind of interaction, Zoom interactions and other interactions. I'm not sure if we had it for this specific sample. But thanks, good question. Okay, so I will move on. Yeah. So the Thomas Resilient Youth Lab is focused on, just as I said, trying to understand how to increase but also to study the engagement of fathers, the involvement of fathers, and understanding how that fits into positive youth development. So I wanted to understand the challenges for father engagement, and I figured that some of those were going to be attitudinal, policy, and practice. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I would suggest that we start off with the assumption of interest, that fathers are interested, that fathers want to be involved. What we're seeing across the literature is that even more so now, and I think that's coming from people like Hammer, McAdoo, and others, that fathers are more involved in their children's lives than their fathers were, and than their grandfathers were. Men are more so beginning to define their own masculine identity and their manhood as being able to care for my family, being able to protect my children, care for my children, provide for my children. And what we're also seeing is an increase in the visibility of the nurturing role for fatherhood. And again, these are pictures from the dad gang. And you will see, like I said, throughout, the dad gang is specifically concerned with trying to normalize these conversations, because essentially what they're saying is, we don't want to be celebrated for this. And people are always surprised when black dads say this, that if I'm walking down the street with my kid and I'm pushing the stroller, or I'm changing a diaper, or I'm wiping my kid's nose, don't stop and give me a round of applause. Because there is nothing unique about that. That is what I do as a father. That is what I do as a man. Would you give a round of applause to anybody else? You probably would not, and you should not. So it's essentially saying, we have always been doing these things. There's nothing new about it. The fact that you're now seeing it or now becoming aware of it does not change the fact that we've always been present. We've always been here for our families. It's tied to the fathering role, and non-resident black fathers are, like I said, coming from Kathy Eden's work, just as involved as any other father group. So this is the Milwaukee study. So we wanted to understand what black fatherhood looked like in Milwaukee, and we wanted to understand the connections that black fathers had to resources in the community, specifically around pregnancy. So we went into Milwaukee and connected with the African American Breastfeeding Network, that is Ms. Dalvery Blackwell. In the corner there, I want to make sure I said the name correctly, who has been doing just tremendous work in Milwaukee for the last few decades, specifically among black new and expectant mothers, so mothers and fathers. So we went in, and she specifically dealt with mothers for a while. We went in and challenged her to start thinking about what that work would look like for fathers. You've been doing all this really great work with the mothers, and you have this captive audience, dads who are present. How can you marshal those resources, make best use of those resources while you have them? And so we went in to figure out, one, are the narratives that we've always been hearing, are they true? Two, we wanted to see what kinds of benefits and supports fathers were finding, and whether or not fathers' presence was really making any impact on families. What we found was, one, I'll stay here. There was significantly high level of involvement, as we would expected, but not as people would generally assume. And you will see that a lot of these dads were coming in. This is the report back session. So after our study was done, we published the first study. We came back and met with the community and said, here's what we found. What are your thoughts? Let's talk about some of the things that we're finding in the data. What's the next step? What kind of programming? What would programming look like? We found significantly high levels of involvement, and that was across fathers. Didn't matter the father's age, the father's socioeconomic status, whether the father was physically living with the mom or not. We heard stories of dads who were saying, my daughter was born 8 months ago and I have not seen her. I know she was born because somebody told me that she was born. I know she's somewhere with her mom and I've not seen her, and I'm still trying to figure out how I get to see her. What resources can I use to get to connect with my daughter? Which is not part of the story that we're hearing. The story that we hear in pop culture is that black dads are not present. So if mom goes in for services, the record that's taken is there's no dad present. We ask her about dad and she said she doesn't know where dad is, that dad is not involved. And that's the story that's taken. The story that's not heard is this dad who's saying, I am depressed. I have difficulty going to work. I have difficulty sleeping because I know my daughter was born 8 months ago and I can't find a way to get to her, and I want to be part of her life. I think about her. I wonder what's going on with her. I love her. I know my ex and myself, we have our challenges, and that is why we're not able to parent together, and I can't find my kid. Yep.
It's, so in that finding, were you worried about selection issue? Like the father that was already part of that already accompanying the wife, that they already are someone different than the father that wasn't accompanying.
So in this study, we had a range of fathers. We had fathers who were not married. We had fathers and mothers who were married. We had individuals where their partners were not here. They were talking about other partners who were not physically with them or not in a relationship with them. We had people who were not in a relationship together, but were still co-parenting and were still present. So we had a full gamut of potential experiences, but very good question. Thank you for that. I'll skip. I was going to tell you another story, but we'll skip. Blah, blah, blah. One of the challenges that fathers kept talking about was, I see your hand, was the limited resources. They were saying essentially that when mom can find resources like AABN, from the time mom is pregnant, mom can go out in the community and can find maybe 4 or 5 different resources and kind of curate and decide which ones are best for her specific situation at that point in time. But when we go out to find resources, we can't find any. And when we finally do find one and eventually learn to trust them enough to be able to be our real selves and explore these issues, they hang around for a couple of months or maybe a year, and then they disappear, often because they lose funding. So fathers are finding it very difficult to find resources. And so part of it was trying to figure out ways to provide additional support for fathers or to help engender support among fathers themselves. Sorry, go ahead, your question?
It kind of inspired the last question. So I haven't engaged with this literature for a while, but there's a literature that seeks to estimate what I would call in the jargon of my world the treatment effect of divorce. Mm-hmm. And my recollection of that literature when I engaged with it was that the sort of standard, the summary finding was that in general divorce is bad for children unless the parents really don't get along. Mm-hmm. And it's violent in the household or whatever, and then probably on net it's best for parents. So that's I would call that in my jargon sort of treatment effect. Mm-hmm. Is there, and what I heard in the last question was kind of a question about treatment effect heterogeneity, right? Is it the case that there's a bunch of dads where it'd be really good if they were more involved? It's good that they are involved now, it would be great if they were more involved, but there's also some dads where, given where they are in their lives, maybe it's okay if they're not so involved. Is that how this literature thinks about things? Or?
I am not sure if this specific literature speaks to that. I will say that kind of when you talk about father involvement or any involvement in a child's life, you start off with these caveats either in the back of your mind or in the forefront of your mind, that not every adult is a positive influence, and kind of thinking about the dads in the incarceration study that I talked about earlier, who self-selected and said, I think I might be a risk to my child, so I am going to select myself out of my child's life. Not sure if I would necessarily agree with them. The fact that you're thinking about that means that you're a good dad. And so let's think about, let's think about ways to minimize the transfer of risks. Let's think about ways to minimize the presence of risk in your life and to engage your very sincere desire and intention to be present in your child's life. So let's kind of accentuate the positive and work to minimize the negative. And I think a similar thing would exist in this case, where the fathers who may have domestic violence issues, for instance, may be less likely to be engaged in a study like this. Moms are probably less likely themselves to be engaged in a study like this. One, just because of psychic energy. You just don't have the time to deal with a study like this if you're trying to just stay alive, if you're trying to avoid potential harm to yourself and to your child. So this would not be part of that study, but very good question nonetheless. Thank you very much. Okay. So what we found was one, so we did a couple of focus groups among the mothers and fathers, and also collected some survey data from both mothers and fathers as well. What we found was that the impact of father involvement, when the fathers were present and involved in the pregnancy, and mother and father's interparental relationship quality, those two things, the involvement and the quality of the relationship, were significant in that they played a protective role for mother's mental health and well-being. We're currently exploring what that same involvement and interparental relationship quality looks like as far as predicting father's involvement in pregnancy and predicting father's attachment to the child. So trying to understand, one, that father's presence is protective for mothers. So when we start talking about maternal and infant health, we need to be thinking not just about maternal and infant health, but thinking about the health of the family system altogether. And when we start thinking about the health of the family system, thinking about the contributions, potential contributions of the father, and also the potential benefits. So it's the father giving to the family and ensuring mom's health is better, ensuring the child's development is better, but the father's involvement in that space redounds to the father himself, both from psychological benefits, but also from mental health benefits as well. Yep, that was the study. Let's skip this. Yep.
Ask a question on the last point.
Mm-hmm.
So this is IRP, and we think a lot about money and income. And so one of the things I think I understand from these literatures is that fathers who are engaged are also more likely to be contributing financially to the household, either through formal child support or informal child support. So how do you distinguish, if those two things go together, how do you think about the role of money and economic resources?
Weirdly, because hopefully you will not recall my affiliate membership with IRP for this. I think less of the money and more. Catherine's like, I think less of the money and more of the involvement and the physical, psychological support that fathers can provide. And I'll tell you why. I had about maybe 10 or so years ago, I had a father in a therapy room with me. His son had been brought in by the mom for some significant behavioral issues. And dad came into the room, and that's probably where my interest in fatherhood came from. Dad had been recently incarcerated. And when he walked into the room, I had my immediate automatic thoughts. He was huge. His muscles had muscles. He was bald. He looked hard. He looked tough. And we were sitting talking about his child. And he started talking about the things that he wanted to do with his child. We started talking about the things that he was having difficulty doing with his child. And he said, I don't know what to do with these soft things. Soft things meaning this thing about talking about your feelings and emotions and wanting to nurture. He didn't know how to do that. And so I said, great, thank you for that gift. I am here to help you deal with these soft things and explore these soft things. Then he said, I want to take my kid out to, not Chuck E. Cheese's, one of those Zoom rooms where kids bounce around and go crazy. I want to take my kid out to do that. I want to take my kid out to a movie. I want to do these things with my kid, but I can't because I don't have money. And I don't have money because I can't find a job. And I can't find a job because I will apply for a job and they'll say, great, and then they do a background check and suddenly they don't need me anymore. And I know exactly why they don't need me anymore, because they see the background check, they see a black man who looks big and buff like me, and they assume it's not going to be safe to have me around. And so he was talking about his catch-22. And if we had to focus only on the money, then this dad would continually be showing up as uninterested, uninvolved. Mom had said to me pretty much the same thing, that he's not involved, he's not interested. I said, well, is it okay if I call him? Well, he won't answer. Even if you talk to him, he won't come. That was not true. He did come. And we talked about other ways that he could be involved without having money involved. Things that he could do. Show up and hang out with the kid at mom's home. Hang out with him in a park. Different things, nurturing things that did not include money, that did not include child support payments. So that's why sometimes I find myself, I understand the benefit and the need for the financial element of it, but I think often, not you, I think often our policies focus so much on the finances at the expense of what the finances should mean. That the finances should represent nurturing. The finances should represent direct interest. The finances should represent what Venus and Serena Williams' father talked about. Having this overwhelming desire to see your child have everything that you didn't have. And everything doesn't necessarily mean finances, but just that new life, different life chances. Yes?
So you shared a little bit about the story of the father who was absent because couldn't go see his child and see what he was distressed at that time.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, and that intrigued me because, that's something like, if you had a parent that wasn't pregnant and, then wasn't able to see their parent, of course they would have emotional distress, but it's not something I would have thought about, someone for a parent of a father who might not have ever been able to meet his father. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about, the prevalence of that phenomenon, like the impact on the father's mental well-being. Like if you've seen that in studies or in your own practice.
So I could probably talk a little bit more about my own practice. So I do some work with the Urban League of Madison. We currently have a fatherhood program that's funded through WPP, Wisconsin Partnership Program, and run through Urban League of Madison and Rebalance Life Wellness organization. Just opened the Perry Family Clinic. So that whole nice collaboration. And come across fathers who are either dealing with post-incarceration challenges or dealing with child support issues and how that affects their family. Most recently, I had some conversations, not necessarily with fathers from that space, but with a couple of fathers, and they were talking about their own mental health needs and how often it conflicts with the expectations within the family. And sometimes the expectations that are set up within the family are expectations from outside of the family that are imposed on the family, that the family then imposes on its members. That, of course, increases stress within the family and can cause potential crisis. Fathers were also talking about the challenges of being in different states or being not geographically linked to their children. The perennial issue of what happens to my child support payments. I make a child support payment, and I haven't seen my child in the last 3 months. And I only hear from mom when a child support payment is due or when it lapses. Then I see mom. Or I show up to pick up my child, and every time there's a pickup, it's a point of contention. It's a point where two opposing words meet, and there's just a hurricane of emotions. And how do I work with that for myself, but how do I also be aware of what's going on for me and understanding that my child is standing at our feet watching the two of us go at each other, and I'm setting standards for behavior for my child. So a lot of really intricate thoughts that are going on for fathers as they're trying to navigate those spaces, as they're navigating those spaces and occupying those spaces. Thanks for that question. How much time do we have left?
Half an hour.
Oh, geez, we have a little time. Okay, I'm good. Okay, so we spent a little bit of time talking about from the AABN study, not being able to find resources and trying to figure out what the challenges are for the resources. Fathers were saying things like, when I go in for the appointments with my partner and the expectant baby, often I feel like I'm a piece of furniture. So I walk into the room and the doctor says hi to both of us, hi to mom by name and says hi dad or hi whatever, and we sit down and they kind of spread the gel and everything over the mom's stomach, and we're doing the ultrasound, and the screen is angled towards mom, and the two of them are talking, and I just slowly disappear in a corner of the room. And it's one thing, I understand, to have the screen angled towards mom so that she could see. But wouldn't it make sense to eventually say, and dad, look at this. This is what we're seeing. Here's what's going on. Because what moms were saying was, in the room, at the moment, dealing with everything that was going on, plus my own emotions and my own experiences, very often the questions that myself and my spouse had discussed at home elude me, and I forget to ask them. The concerns that I have about my toes swelling or my ankles swelling or my feet hurting or my back hurting, I forget to ask them because either I'm very scared or I'm nervous or something pops up on the screen and I don't know what it means, so I'm asking about those things and I forget to ask them. And then we leave and like, oh, shit, I should have asked that. I meant to ask this. But if dad is involved, then dad gets to ask some of those questions. Dad gets to support that space. But often fathers are saying they're not involved. Mothers are saying even when fathers are physically present, they're still not engaged in any real way in those spaces. That is, of course, not across the board for every single person, but in general, that was what we were hearing. So when it kind of reminded me of this other study that I had done earlier, looking at therapy services provided to children and whether or not psychologists, social workers, and psychology residents were ready and were able and were providing services to fathers in those spaces. So when a child came in for therapy, were either of these clinicians prepared and ready and able to engage fathers in those spaces? So we looked at about 39 clinicians. I told you the three levels of clinicians. And three general themes emerged from the focus group of these clinicians. And I'm only going to tell you about the themes that came up for the social workers, because that's the paper that we presented. The three themes were, one, that clinicians' perceptions of the role of fathers, the barriers that clinicians and fathers identified for engaging fathers, and clinicians' preparedness for that work. The first one, meaning clinicians' perception of the role of fathers, that was still evolving. So we were surprised because of where we were and who we were dealing with, that clinicians were still saying things like, this is the father's role. So mom bringing a kid in for therapy, that's mom's role. And dad going out to work, is the father's role. And so that's why we don't have fathers in therapy, because that's not his job. I know you. I figured out now through you off, Quinn. Go ahead.
What was like the age bracket of clinicians?
Kind
I would argue that matters.
of like you would expect.
Yeah.
There were most of them. I think a few of them were graduate students, so they were third or fourth year grad students, and a few of them were also MSW postdocs.
And then the gender makeup relative?
I think we had primarily white, female. Age group would probably be somewhere between 27 and 35. Yep. So it's not what you'd have expected, but it does exist. We did find others though who were saying, I find ways to support fathers. So I would tell fathers, you matter in this space. Your contribution matters in this space. So we found a really good counter to that as well. The cultural awareness, so understanding the specific awareness of what it means to be a black father, what it means to be a Muslim father, what the cultural values, cultural background, how that might frame or might color or influence the fatherhood role. We also looked at the barriers that clinicians had, but also the barriers for fathers. And clinicians identified their own barriers. That one, their training was often very traditional, very still steeped in some of the old tradition. That their supervision did not seem to engage that space as well. So that if they wanted to engage fathers, they had to go find the literature and bring it back to their supervisors and say, I am interested in doing this thing. Would you support me in this? But often it was not that. Their supervisors were saying, this is important, this is a thing, this is where we want to move with this. For fathers, it was often their stigma. So fathers were saying, there's nothing wrong with my kid. I can tell you a number of different stories where fathers said, my kid doesn't need therapy. I don't know, mom is just overreacting. I don't need my kid to be in therapy. In fact, I'd like to take my kid out of this thing. And of course, the co-parenting decision, which usually kind of overlapped. And clinicians' preparedness. So some clinicians were talking about the applicability. How easy is it to actually include this? We have a 45-minute session with 15 minutes later for writing a progress notes. How do we get fathers involved in those 45 minutes without, there's no insurance code for billing. We can't figure out how to bill that fatherhood time. If we're connecting with fathers to try to schedule with them outside of those 45 minutes for a session, how do we bill for that time? And if we can't bill for that time, whose time is it then? It's going to be more work on me to do that, to kind of do that space. And of course, the supervision, the absence of supervision around that. Tools and guidelines. One clinician talked about the challenge of engaging, for instance, parents who had child support agreements, but also had, what's the word I'm looking for? That thing where you separate the child's time with the parent? Shared custody. Thank you so much. I had a brain fart for a while. So those visitation agreements and the custody sharing. When you have a child who's supposed to be with a parent at a particular time, but your session falls within the time of a different parent, how do you manage that? When you have one parent bringing the child in and the other parent says, I don't want my child coming in, what's the legal cover for you as a clinician for wanting to bring that parent in and not being able to find any support around that? Specific tools about how to go about encouraging and inviting parents in. That was absent. And of course, the biggest one was the institutional culture. Before you could even start doing anything about that as an individual clinician, your institution has to value that. If your institution doesn't value it, then they won't support your time. they won't provide the support for you or the resources or the training for you. So those were significant issues. I can skip that. I wanted to understand also that inter-parent relationship and how it affected fathers' engagement in services with their children. So I did a really quick and dirty survey of about 380 fathers. You will see that they're not very diverse. It was predominantly white, 73% white, 76% married, 87% college level or higher. So it's a very different population from the ones that I've been talking about so far. Still, though, there was significant interest in what was going on in this sample. One of the things that we wanted to explore was, let me go back a little bit actually. Talking about the interparenting relationship, we wanted to understand the quality of that co-parenting relationship or that interparenting relationship, and we looked at 3 dimensions. We had maternal gatekeeping. That's the mother's intentions or actions that are meant to determine how and to what extent the father has access to the child. The alliance, so there's a really good, strong connection between the mother and the father. And then there's maternal undermining. So it's that thing that we see on TV all the time, where dad is changing the diapers and mom says, "Let me do it because you're not doing it well." Versus allowing dad to change the diaper and having a blown up diaper. And dad learns from the blow up diaper that I might need to tighten this a little bit more next time, right? Allowing that maternal undermining. And so we looked at those 3 levels of relationship quality as indicators of parents involved, of father involvement. What we found across the board was that the influence of the co-parenting relationship on father engagement was a challenge. More specifically, the maternal gatekeeping seemed to be over and above the worst, as you would expect, the worst predictor of bad outcomes or poorer outcomes when we started thinking about involvement of fathers. The best outcomes existed when parental alliance, parents working together, which kind of makes sense, was high, and father's satisfaction in his own life was high. So fathers had to be happy with where they were, but also the co-parenting alliance had to be really good. And when those 2 things met, even if fathers had high levels of stigma or fathers had lower levels of intention of engaging in therapy, they would still go on to engage in therapy with their children because they felt good about themselves and their lives, and they felt like they were being supported by the other parent. What we also found was that when fathers have positive intentions of engaging in therapy with their children, even if their stigma is high. So I don't really think that, I don't want people to know that my child is in therapy. I don't really want to engage in therapy, but I think it could be useful. They're more likely to engage in therapy. And that's even though maternal gatekeeping might be high. And the third, gatekeeping seemed to undermine fathers' engagement across the board. So whether you had a positive view of therapy, whether you had higher intentions to engage in therapy, if you perceived that mom was not going to allow you access to the child, then you were less likely to be engaged. Often it was I can't do anything about that. I'm not going to fight it. I'll skip this actually. So just around the beginning of the pandemic, myself and Aaron Perry, some of you will probably know him, and this is Logan Edwards over from University of Wisconsin, I think Whitewater. We came together and started thinking about what the effects that the pandemic was having on the black community in general. But when we talked about the black community, were we talking about black men? Were we talking about black men in their fatherhood roles? And the answer was often not. So we wanted to create a space for black men to show up and find support, for black men to come in and ask questions. Craig Garfield says that when fathers show up in health spaces, one of the prime reasons they show up is for information. They come with their child and they have very specific questions. Doc, why does my child have this bump? Doc, what does this rash mean? Doc, what do I do about this rash to make sure it goes away? I'm going to be back in a month and let you know if this rash went away. If it didn't go away, you and I are about to have some problems, Doc, because I will need to figure out what do I do next to fix this rash. And so we wanted to create a space where fathers could come in and say, okay, here's what's going on with me, or here's what's going on with my family, or here's what's going on with my child. What can I do? I want information. I want support. So we created this COVID-19 Black Male Support Group, and we were blown away at the reach. We were expecting it to just focus on Madison, and so all the people that we brought in were predominantly Madison natives, Madison public health, Madison. We had Joe Parisi, we had the Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, and a number of others come in to talk about Madison specifically related to the pandemic. But we were surprised to find that we were suddenly reaching people in Tennessee and South Carolina and California and Trinidad and Tobago and St. Lucia and Ireland. We went global without recognizing it. And people weren't just listening, but they were writing in and saying, you said something about how I should engage my own anxiety, and I am going to go try this now with my 21-year-old daughter who's currently at college, and I'm worried about her. I'm going to think about my anxiety, and then I'm going to call her to find out how she's doing so that she has that social connection, even though she's socially isolated. And we found significant benefit to this across the board. We were able to bring in a number of individuals to come in and talk about some very specific issues. So for example, when the discussion around the vaccine for COVID was first happening, we said, come over here. Let's talk to these black men about what vaccines are, how those things are developed, what's the rollout going to be. And that was a really good space for men to come in and ask questions and kind of seek education around that. Beyond that, and so this is part of the idea of engaging this space and kind of expanding this space where mental health is a normal conversation. Talking about vulnerabilities, embracing vulnerabilities is a normal conversation for black men and for black fathers. And so most recently, as a way of expanding that discussion and expanding that space, we wrote a couple of articles for thesalon.com, one of which we wrote just, I don't know if you still remember that time when there was a huge shortage of infant formula, and there was lots of talk about how moms were struggling, and it was a real strain for mom and really stressful for mom to find milk and how they're concerned about their babies. And we're like, mom is not the only parent in the equation. Dads also feed babies. They may not breastfeed the babies, but they sure as hell bottle feed the babies, and they sure as hell, maybe I shouldn't be saying hell, they sure as heck make the bottles and feed the babies. So let's think, when we're talking about feeding babies and the formula shortage, let's not forget the other parent in the equation. We wrote another article just around the time when Oprah Winfrey was eulogizing her father, and we kind of pulled in the two experiences, Oprah Winfrey's just glowing eulogy of her father and the recently released King Richard movie of Venus and Serena Williams, and how glowingly they spoke about their fathers. And then talking about some of the negative media attention that was coming up for both of those stories, and kind of pulled those two together and said, let's see how these two families talk about the black fathers that were involved. And as a way of, again, raising the import, raising the attention on and spotlighting black fathers. WORT Madison has also kind of allowed us a space to come in, and we had about, I think maybe, we spent all of last summer just dealing with black fathers, black families, black children, exploring all of the issues, the challenges, and again, continuing to reignite and re-inject black fatherhood roles in there. Sorry, go ahead.
Just wondering, because this picture reminded me of my brother who's gay, and they have a 1-year-old baby, and I'm just wondering, in your group, do you have like sexual minority and like do you, because I think in a gay couple, there's no mother, like the mother is always going to be involved, and like is there a way to bridge the gap between like a typical straight dad and like, you know, I don't know, like just like having a conversation, like sharing information or something like that. You know?
So we've never directly addressed it. We've also never directly rejected it. We leave the space to be what the space is. So if individuals feel comfortable sharing any part of their identity in that space, we allow for it. If individuals choose to focus on one part of their identity, we allow for it. In other words, we deal with whatever people will bring to us, and we create space and will support the development around whatever they bring to us. But no, so far we've not had any of that conversation come in. But thank you for bringing that up. Yep. And most recently, so around Juneteenth, that nexus of, that was not supposed to happen. The nexus of Juneteenth and Father's Day of last year, we released the Black Fatherhood podcast. And this I didn't think it was going to be a podcast. I thought it was going to be a couple of conversations that I was going to have. And I remember thinking about somewhere in 2019, 2020, writing it up on a small whiteboard, and then losing the whiteboard in my basement somewhere. And then I saw some money was available for translating work to larger populations. I thought, this might be a good space for this. So I put up the whiteboard again, dusted it, and like, what is this going to look like? And so we came up with the idea, myself and one of my grad students, Eric Crawford, about thinking about how to translate some of the work that we've done in the lab, but other work that other people around the country are doing around supporting Black fatherhood. And how do you translate that work in a way that is going to be beneficial to the donor? At that time, the donor was UW-Madison Extension and the School of Human Ecology's Equity and Social Justice Network. We wanted to create material that the extension experts could take with them and offer to families, could take with them as education for themselves, and that a father on the street or anybody around the country could just pick up and listen to and be able to get some level of benefit, informational, motivational, or otherwise. And so we came up with this podcast. We had 12 episodes, and it eventually morphed into 15 episodes, addressing a number of different issues, from co-parenting to whether or not it's the father's role to provide and protect, and what that means historically, a number of different really interesting issues, and then trying to find experts from across the country to speak to them. So we had Ron Mincy pop up to tell us the history of child welfare and child support payments and what it meant from pre-antebellum South to today, and how the legacy of those issues still affect fathers today and affect fatherhood policy today. We had Shauna Cooper come in and talk to us about other fatherhood issues, co-parenting and communication. And we brought in Cleopatra Caldwell and Dr. Deloney Hill from Flint, Michigan, to talk to us about their combined almost 50 years of work in fatherhood, and talk to us about what led them into that work to begin with, what they were able to do, if they were able to accomplish those goals that they went in with, and then thinking about what they hope the next generation of researchers, yourself and myself, will add to the work that they've already set down. And by the end of this, we had 15 episodes, which are now currently available anywhere you can find your podcast. We're working on season 2. That should hopefully be coming around sometime around June of this year. But the intention of the podcast was not just to be able to find another space so Alvin could talk some more. It was to do 3 things. And we think of it, the acronym that we use is EVE. Is the eve of raising this national normalized conversation of Black fatherhood. It's to elevate Black fatherhood, to educate Black fathers, to validate Black fathers, and to elevate Black fatherhood. Those are the 3 things that we're hoping to do with the podcast, and we're hoping that we find other people students and faculty like David Pate to jump on board and kind of lend their effort as we continue moving down that path. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and your patience with me today.